Mauricio Cortina. I am a Mexican psychiatrist who graduated from medical school from Mexico City, and I decided to study psychoanalysis because of the influence of Erich Fromm, who lived in Mexico 20-30 years, and I was able to hear some of his conferences. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. I want to be a psychoanalyst. So after graduating from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, I went to study psychiatry at the Menninger Foundation, a very famous psychiatric center that had psychoanalytic orientation. And when I finished that training, I went to Washington to study with somebody who had worked with Erich Fromm, Michael Maccabee, who was an anthropologist, social psychologist, and psychoanalyst. And in Washington, I took a course at the Washington School of Psychiatry. It was founded by Harry Stack Sullivan, an interpersonalist. And I read, during this 3-year course in psychotherapy, I read Bowlby. And I was telling people here that I told the director of the program, hey, this is really good stuff. How come we're not teaching it? And he said, well, why don't you teach it? So I immediately became an expert in attachment theory because nobody else in Washington was teaching it. So that's how I became an expert. So, many years later, a mutual friend of us got us in touch with Mario, and Mario and I got in touch, and we decided through internet to edit a book on attachment theory and the psychoanalytic process, and that's how I knew Mario. And and then, you know, we've continued in other projects and other things. So enough about me.
Well, I'm Mario Marrone. I'm a psychiatrist. I train in medicine in Rosario, Argentina. And then I moved to London and I work as a psychiatrist in the National Health Service. And also training group therapy and psychoanalysis. And I have the privilege of having supervision with John Bowlby at the Tavistock Clinic for 10 years. So to me, the attachment theory is very much linked to general psychiatry because I was working in a psychiatric hospital, and when I was having supervision with Bowlby, many of my patients were very disturbed people. And I remember that one day I said to Bowlby, you know, I want to have supervision about my psychotic patients. And Bowlby said, well, I'm not very experienced in psychosis because that has not been my clinical field, but I can tell you something. She said, you meet with the patients, give them a sense of safety in the relationship, and explore their attachment history, and you find out that the symptoms look after themselves. And so this is what I did. But one of the interesting things was that I discovered that all my patients had traumatic experiences in childhood. So to me, it has been an association between severe psychiatric disturbance and severe attachment disturbance in childhood. The history about the John Bowlby was that when he was a medical student, he worked for a while as a volunteer in a center for adolescents with disturbed behavior. And while he was working there, he discovered that all these adolescents came from dysfunctional families. So he made an association between family dysfunctionality and behavioral disturbance. And then that oriented him to work as a psychiatrist with children and adolescents. And then when he qualified and he did his training in psychoanalysis at the Institute of Psychoanalysis in London, he became the director of department at the Tavistock Clinic, which is it's a psychotherapy clinic that belongs to the National Health Service. And he renamed the Department of Children and Parents. It was originally the Department of Children, but then he called it Children and Parents because he said you cannot treat the children without treating the parents, you know, and what really matters is the children-parent relationship. So that was his initial approach. And while he was working there, he got in contact with he had a sort of a friendly relationship with Anna Freud, and who had a clinic, not a long distance from the Tavistock Clinic. And with Anna Freud began to work. She established a clinic with the children who had been separated from their parents through war and through also other reasons. And she had two social workers working with her. And the James and Joyce Robertson, their names. You know, and then Bowlby became interested in how early separation from the parents can create psychological disturbance. So at that point he moved from studying family dysfunctionality to studying separation. And then the Robertson became member of Bowlby's team, and they worked together. And then gradually Bowlby was incorporating into his team other colleagues who made a contribution from their own point of view. For instance, Colin Murray Parks was a psychiatrist who was very interested in bereavement, and John Bowlby Hall, who was a psychiatrist interested in systemic family therapy, who made a link between systemic family therapy and attachment. So, and that was the way Bowlby worked. He always trying to incorporate people from different disciplines who could make a contribution. Well, I published a book, Attachment and Interaction. So probably it's a good interaction, but there are many books now on attachment. There is a long list of books on attachment theory, and yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is when people are very serious about studying attachment theory, I tell them read the trilogy of Bowlby.
Exactly.
Because there's more in that trilogy than just attachment theory. In those books, Bowlby also talked about the effects of bereavement, about defenses, about the internal representations. So the nucleus of attachment theory is the secure base phenomenon, the use of the parent, the attachment figure for base exploration. That's the very nucleus, but around that there are many other concepts that Bowlby talked about in that trilogy that are very rich. So I strongly recommend, if anybody's interested in attachment theory, that they read the trilogy of Attachment, Separation, and Loss. Well, attachment can be thought in two ways. It can be thought two complementary ways. It can be taught as an attachment relationship, the relationship between a child who seeks protection and care and an attachment figure who provides that care. So in that sense, you can talk about attachment as a relationship, which it certainly is. But attachment theory is also a theory a new theory of motivation, because the child has an instinct and motivation to seek protection and care when the child is distressed. And the mothers, mostly in other species, it's almost always the mother, protects the child fiercely, sometimes at the expense of her own life. So Attachment theory is also a theory about different motivations that seek protection, care, exploration. When the baby feels secure, the baby explores. The activation of the fear system. So there's a series of motivations that get linked together that form part of the secure-based phenomenon.
Because when you mention the Bowlby trilogy, the Attachment and Loss, these books, I agree with you. I think that it's, when I mention my book, it's an introduction. But if you really want to understand attachment theory, I think you have to read Bowlby and these 3 volumes. And in fact, I think one of my concerns is that now attachment theory has become very popular. And a lot of people are talking about attachment theory. And many people believe that attachment theory is about classifying people in pattern of attachment, you know? And so the purpose of attachment theory is to find out whether you're avoidant or ambivalent or whatever, you know? But I think this is a gross reduction of what attachment theory is. Attachment theory is about understanding psychological function and in interpersonal context, and understanding the theory of motivation that you mentioned, you know. And in order to do so, we need to read Bowlby. And I think that one of my disappointment is that I've been teaching people who say that they apply attachment theory to psychotherapy or to clinical practice, and they haven't read Bowlby. Well, I think it's an important point, because many people believe that attachment theory is about early childhood development, which is in a way it is, but it's about attachment across the life cycle, you know. And one of the things we know in terms of attachment theory is that the way our relationship goes throughout the life cycle is very important for our mental health and sense of emotional stability.
Yes, Bowlby has famously said that attachment is from birth through the tumba?
Grave.
Yes, to the grave, from the birth to the grave. So the difference between attachment relationships in infancy, between parents and children, and between adults, is that between adults a healthy attachment is mutual. When we are distressed or we feel vulnerable, if we have a healthy relationship with our spouse, with our close friend who's an attachment figure, where we can find help and comfort from them, and vice versa. When they feel in need, it's important that they know that their adult attachment figure will be supportive of this. So that's the difference. It's an equal relationship in adulthood. The other thing I would like to say is there is more to the relationship of attachment. There's other type of important relationships. There's relationship to peers, there's relationship to siblings, and there's an innate desire of little children to play with their parents when they're not distressed. So there's a reciprocal relationship between the child is distressed, the parent comes and comforts the child is then free to explore. But not just explore the material world, they are avid explorer, but to explore the social world. That's a social engagement system. So there's a lot of related motivations that are based on having a secure base. Because if you have a secure base, you can explore the material world and you can explore the social world more as equals. So I just wanted to add that we have to build on attachment to develop a larger view of human relationships.
Well, it depends what we have Bowlby talked about a hierarchy of attachment. And he said that we organize our attachment in a hierarchical way. That means that we make attachment to different people. And for instance, the child may make an attachment to mother, then to father, grandparents, other members of the family, siblings, and so on. And this attachment organized like a pyramid in a hierarchical way. So there are some attachments that are more important than others. You know, and in adult life, the same happens. You know, we have people who, we have multiple connections with people, but they are also organized in this hierarchy. I think the difference between the hierarchy in children and in adults is we as adults have a greater freedom to reorganize our pyramids, you know. We may decide that to stop an important relationship because it's no good for us and form another relationship. The child finds it much more difficult because it's much more dependent on the parents' supply. And this is one of the problems with the early childhood trauma, is that the child, if the child is maltreated or neglected or abused by the parents, the child cannot go to immediately to another parental figure and say, I want to substitute my parents with you. You know, and so the only possibility a child has of managing that problem is to dissociate, to make a split. So on the one hand, he relates to the parent as the parent was a good parent, and on the other hand, he relates to the parent realizing that the parent is not good enough. I don't know whether you want to say a bit more about dissociation.
Well, I will. I just will add in terms, I think, where your question is coming as people talk about avoidant, resistant, and disorganized attachment, which is a good lead to talk about Mary Ainsworth. So attachment theory has a father, which is John Bowlby, and a mother. That's the way I like to think about it, Mary Ainsworth. Why was Mary Ainsworth very important? Well, she was important for two reasons. She was an extraordinary researcher, made very good observations. I'll talk about that in just a minute. And she was important historically because, as Mario knows very well because he lived it in London, Bowlby was rejected by the psychoanalytic community in London and then in most of the world. So the reason it survived, the reason why we still have attachment theory, I think is because of the researchers. Mary Ainsworth developed a way to be able, after making observations, very systemic observations, first in Uganda and then in Baltimore. In Baltimore, she had 25 families where each family, each mother-child relationship was studied at home for 72 hours throughout the first year. So she had all these rich observations of the quality of the mother's attachment to the child. It's the quality of the attachment, not that the child develops an attachment per se, what's important for development. And there she realized that some children were better able to use the mother to provide comfort and to explore the world once they were comforted, and some children were not. They were anxiously attached. Well, the history of Mary Ainsworth is that once she had made these very rich observations, first in a rural area in Uganda and then in a middle-class sample in Baltimore, Maryland, she talked to her team and said, look, we can publish this book, but nobody's going to read it because in scientific circles, naturalistic observations don't count for anything. It's all about statistics. So the story I've gotten from her students is that in 15 minutes, she designed a laboratory procedure where she could study how these different kind of quality of relationships played out. And it was a very elegant 20-minute procedure. Everybody knows about the strange situation where the mother and the baby or the attachment is brought to a laboratory and the child leaves the room twice. 12 to 16 months, 18 months is when this is a valid procedure. And depending how the child, when he comes back, how the mother and child greet each other, you can tell if the child is securely or insecurely attached. If the child, mom comes in, knocks into the door, and the child is distressed, and walks to the child, opens the door, doesn't avoid contact, the mother comforts him, that's a securely attached child. Well, those children and those 72 hours of observation, each family had mothers who had been most responsive, who had been sensitive to the children, who would ask themselves what's wrong with the child. If he's crying all night, does he have a colic? They were curious. They wanted to understand what the communications of the child were about. So they were what she calls sensitively responsive. That's a secure child. Then there were some children that would mother come in, and when the mother knocks the door and comes in, what happens with avoidantly attached children? They focus the attention back to attractive toys, you know. So they use their attention to look away from mother. Why? Because they know from experience that those mothers would generally reject them when they were distressed. So mother comes in, they're distressed, so they try to regulate themselves. They play with toys. They look like very independent children, and many people thought this is temperamental. It has nothing to do with the relation. These are children that are more just temperamentally are different. Well, we know that's not true because it's very simple to, cortisol is a hormone that is secreted when they're stressed. You can take saliva pre and post procedure and see if these children are differently distressed. Well, it turns out that children with an avoidant attachment are equally distressed than the other children. So this is the first example of we're seeing a defense right there at 12 months old. The child is focusing his attention away from the mother to regulate themselves. Now, if the child was really distressed, they would go to the mother. If you increase more, so and finally there was another children whose mother came in, like the secure babies. They would greet the mother. Mother would try to comfort them, but and the instruction is, when the baby is comforted, put him down, see if he plays with the toys, the secure baby, see if he uses exploration. When the mother tries to put them down, they do not settle. They are very distressed. They start crying and they want to be picked up. The mother tries to comfort it. They'll get angry with the mother and throw the toy. The mother gives her a toy to the baby. She throws a toy. So they're angry. They do not settle. So these babies had mothers who generally to be inconsistent is the general view. Sometimes they were available. So they keep the attachment system going to see if they'll get the attention from an inattentive mother. And then years later, Mary Ainsworth discovered that some of these children did not fit into any category of secure, and they were atypical. And she wanted to understand why these children were atypical. So she studied hundreds of strange situations. And she thought she was going to discover a pattern, but she didn't discover a pattern. What she discovered is little signs of disorganization in the children. For instance, the mother would come into the room and the child would throw themselves into the floor and not move for 20 seconds. Or they would seem dissociated when they would be frozen. Or the child would crawl and go to the corner of the room. These are very strange behaviors. So the question is, why is this baby behaving so strangely? There was one thing in common. These babies had mothers who were either frightened or were frightening. So if the mother's frightening, the child has what Mary Main called a problem of fear without solution. Instinctively, they're going to go to the mother to get support. But the mother, if she's very harsh, the child will want to move away. So approximation and move away. The child cannot resolve that conflict, so they disorganize because they are two diametrically opposed impulses. The most interesting, though, were because most parents do the best for their children and are not mistreating. The most interesting category were mothers who did not abuse their children, but were frightened when the baby sought comfort. Why were these mothers frightened? Well, it turns out, without exceptions, all these mothers had a trauma of their own. So when the baby gets distressed, it unconsciously activates the trauma, and they're frightened. Babies are very good in being able to read mothers' faces. Evolutionarily, we're programmed to read facial expressions of emotion. Babies are very good at this. It's the same thing. Oh, I'm distressed, my mother's frightened, I have to move away. It's the same effect, disorganization. One last thing. I'm sorry this is a little bit long, but I think it's important to understand it. Meyer has said, and I agree with it, there's other sources of disorganization. In my clinical experience, I have found that parents who are very shaming, that shame their child all the time, very toxically shaming, has the same effect. Because the child looks for comfort and the mother or the parent or whoever's the main attachment figure shames them. You shouldn't cry, you shouldn't this, you shouldn't do that. And I think that can be very disorganizing. I think dysfunctional families can be very frightening and create disorganization. So I agree with a comment you made, I think, in Sevilla, that this is one form of disorganization, but there are other events in the family can also create disorganization in the baby. And we know from experience, I'll stop there, that from longitudinal studies, that the most serious psychopathology comes from children who have a history of disorganized attachment. Children who have an avoidant attachment or an ambivalent attachment, if that's the only risk factor, they might not develop a psychiatric disorder. But disorganized attachment is another story. And I think that's clinically very, very important, because otherwise you can't understand families that seem normal. You don't know why this patient is so disturbed until you start hearing stories like, before I was born, my mother lost 2 babies. Well, okay, the mother was in mourning, and had not assimilated that loss, and she was frightened of losing her baby. So that produced, things like that. So
yes, one of the elements of this, there are several elements. One is that we are in the field of intergenerational transmission. I think one contribution that attachment theory and attachment studies have made to the field of psychopathology is to understand how psychopathology or the vulnerability to develop psychopathology gets transmitted from one generation to another. The other point is that how the toxic effects of parent-child relationship can occur during the pre-verbal phase or later on through verbal communication. I think that it's one of the things that the strange situation shows is that in the early years, when the child has not yet developed his capacity to express himself verbally, he's already assimilating and representing his experiences and developing defense mechanisms and strategies to deal with the attachment issues and emotional issues related to attachment. But then later on, in the family, what is said in the family and how it's said also plays a very important role. So to me, there are 2 moments to be considered. One is the pre-verbal moment, and then there is the second phase, is the verbal interaction in the family.
And they have different levels of representation.
Yeah.
The nonverbal is sub-symbolic, it's enacted. The baby, say a secure baby, the baby who represents the mother represents implicitly. I have positive expectations that when I'm distressed, others, important others, will comfort me. So it's totally unconscious. I just have this within me, these positive expectations. And the other side of it, I have the feeling that I'm lovable. Oh, you know, I can be a lovable creature. I can be somebody who can be taken care of because I've had this experience of parents who were attentive to me. This is totally unconscious. We all have this, or insecurely the same thing. It's only later that with language and symbolic capacity, we can start representing, we have the potential to put this into words. And that's sometimes what we try to do in therapy, to make the implicit explicit.